Good afternoon and welcome across the street and around the world. Welcome to Missions Monday. This week and for the next 3 weeks, we'll be talking about suffering and missions. One of those two topics that those two words together seem to be synonymous. It's almost like you can't say missions without saying suffering. And many Christians who see themselves suffering tend to lean toward missions. So we'll be discussing that today, and we'll be emphasizing being prepared to suffer. Being prepared to suffer. Many missionaries that get on the field, both far and near, seem almost caught off guard when they're called on by God to suffer. And I would even say Christendom in general seems surprised when they suffer. I mean, Peter said, "Think it not strange, because it seems strange to us that we suffer. With God Almighty in our life, why would I have to suffer?" We'll get into that a little bit in missions. In the studio, we have Pastor Tom Sleva, awesome man of God. We have from Helsinki, we have Kiko, and from Houston, Texas, Pride of Texas here, Pastor Christian Moore. So let's begin with a devotional by Pastor Tom.
Oh, really? Already?
Yes, sir. It's all you.
Okay, so this will be very short, and but I had some thoughts related to this idea. Maybe I'll read the scriptures from 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 10 through 12, and it says this. I'll just go right ahead and read it. But thou hast fully known my doctrine, Paul, speaking manner of life, purpose, faith, long suffering, charity, patience, persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, at Iconium, at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And I was thinking about maybe persecution is quite a big word. You know, suffering is a big word. Uh, like, do we do we label what we're dealing with as suffering, or is it, or what is it? You know, really, I spent probably 3/4 of my Christian life not really thinking the things that I was going through actually equated to what the Bible calls suffering. Uh, and I think it's just kind of my makeup, the way I was. You know, I just didn't think, well, I mean, okay, those guys suffered. You know, people are suffering. You know, I mean, I'm going through life. You know, and dealing with things. Do they count for anything? You know, and then we read verses like, uh, "If you suffer with me, you shall reign with me." And I'm thinking, wait a minute. I got to find out if what I'm dealing with is actually suffering or not, because I certainly want to reign with him one day.
Sure.
I want the best. You know, so I came to realize, and this verse helped me actually, because it really is saying anybody that will live spiritually, anybody that will live a spiritual life, you're going to suffer. You will have suffering. And I think through the many few things that I've been through in my life, I see the positive side of suffering, and I see it as an essential, and maybe not an essential to every person's life, not an essential to every Christian's life, but in my case, and I'll leave it to the last thought. But so I have a list here of the different kinds of suffering that we can have on a mission field. Perhaps, I mean, we can obviously, one of the ones we could have would be economic suffering. We don't have enough money. We're trying to figure out how we're going to get the next buck to stay or whatever. There
Mm-hmm.
can be cultural challenges, uh, language barriers. These are different forms of challenges, maybe they wouldn't call them suffering yet. We can suffer in our own home if say the husband and wife are not in total agreement with one another.
Hmm.
The children are not happy. They're there. They're not happy with what they're at. You're dealing with that underlying suffering. Schooling. What are we going to do about schooling? What kind of school? We're going to homeschool. Um, I can't. I'm not going to put my kids in public school. Made the mistake of doing that one time. Um, and then things like the slow growth of the church. Not seeing things happen as quickly as we'd like to. Um, can be that. And we may be in a place where we actually have real threat. We might have, it might be a dangerous place to live. I can't say I've ever been in that place. But whatever it is, and the many other variations that we can call suffering, they have a purpose. And I hate to always bring these verses up in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 because we're so familiar with them.
Yeah.
But Paul had a thorn in the flesh and asked God to rid him of that thorn. And God said, "My grace is sufficient, for my strength is made perfect in your weakness." So I'll just wrap this thought up here, but I think suffering is something that some people may be called to it.
Hmm.
I don't think everybody has the same issues. But my personal testimony is this: without adversity, I'm useless to God.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you why. Pride. Pride is the killer. Pride kills my ministry. And I am wicked, wicked able to jump into it at any moment. And I would say that I'm not being like just getting down on myself or having a poor self-image or anything. No, 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 no. I am amazingly adept to pride, and 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 I would say this: I needed to see that.
Hmm.
God showed it to me, and I said, and I understood a little bit about what Paul said when he said, "Okay, oh, okay. I would rather than glory in my infirmities." Because when I am weak, I am strong, and the power of the Christ rests upon me when I'm weak. Sounds like a crazy trade off for life,
Hmm.
and it is, but I see the upside of suffering, and I see why God allows it. And frankly, the trade off is this: I know Him. I'm 71 years old now, been through a lot of stuff. I'm happy. I'm happy because I got God in my life now. I don't have any kind of track record. Like, okay, you did such a great thing here, there, and there. I don't know what I did. Frankly, I'm sure I did something, but I got this. I got God. I have God, and I know He loves me. So that's my big story for today.
Hmm. This is
Semi practical, a little
it's
little religious.
it's interesting that you brought out. I like what you said about how much of what I call suffering is suffering. Um, as a missionary, we have a way of validating and invalidating suffering. Um, Sometimes by comparison, we'll say what someone else is going through, that's suffering, but what I'm going through is not suffering, or what I'm going through is suffering, but what you're not going through is suffering. And we can even mock different people and say, oh, you call that suffering. I went through this. That was nothing compared to this. And we just assume that we are the barometer of suffering. We're the measuring stick of suffering. And we're not. Um, there's a lot of reasons why we suffer, and um, there's suffering that is attached to um, why walk with God, and maybe that I'm not living in sin, and then there might be suffering that's attached to maybe God is disciplining me. But then there's suffering that's just such as is common to man. Like this is a corrupt world with corrupted bodies and corrupted things. I noticed you mentioned 2 Corinthians 12, um, how Paul says he prays for the thorn to leave. Obviously, he's suffering. But in the previous chapter, before he says that in chapter 11, verses 23 to 33, he mentions 16 things that he goes through, and it doesn't appear like he calls those suffering. You know, I've been beaten, I've done journeying, it's like he doesn't really speak about it like, by the way, I'm suffering. But when you get to chapter 12, all of a sudden, God, take this away because I'm suffering. So there's a lot of things that are in our chapter 11 of our walk with God that we might not consider suffering. And then there's areas that are in our chapter 12 where we're like, God, I need this. But he doesn't even imply in chapter 11 that he even asks God for grace or extra glory. Or there isn't really a lot. He talks about glorying in his infirmities later, but he doesn't really bring that out like, oh, I prayed for God to do something. It's like he celebrates chapter 11. And then in the beginning of 12, he's like, God's got to do something. This is too much for me. I've asked for it. And then he gets the lesson from chapter 11. He says, but I will glory. So I think sometimes as a missionary, maybe I'm walking in both of those. Things like you said, you walk through them and they didn't even seem like they were suffering. And then there's things that you walk through that absolutely felt like you were suffering, but maybe someone else looked at your life and said, that's nothing. So it's like it's a very fluid definition for suffering because we hear the romantic stories. Well, I was on a train, the police came, they handcuffed me, they dragged me 6 years. All of a sudden, I took my last name from me. Oh, and then, oh, by the way, I lost my suitcase and my Bible, everything was in it. And we don't equate those as suffering.
Yeah.
Like, pull up your socks, John. You can do this. What's wrong with you? So how do you really measure that? And we're thinking about today as a group, we're thinking about being prepared for it. It always seems like suffering is this ambush to my experience with God. Have you noticed that, Kiko? Like, it's like, oh, I'm suffering. Wait a minute, Kiko. Wait a minute. Like the first shock when I got saved was that I could still sin. Oh my God, I still make mistakes. But the second big shock is like, wait a minute, why am I still suffering? God Almighty is inside my life. Why am I suffering? I mean, that's the atheist argument about God and about the gospel, about creation. It's like, why is there suffering? So it's almost like Christians come into the church, Kiko, and they're like, I can't believe I'm suffering. Or we see someone else's life, and then we're like Job's friends. We run for a reason. Like, oh, you're suffering because of that right there. Because ordinarily, Job, you're not supposed to suffer. So since you're suffering, this is why, right? And you see missionaries sometimes, Kicker, right? You've been around a little bit. You see missionaries and we banter suffering stories. It almost gets to be like a badge of courage. Well, yeah, what? You had no electricity for 6 years. We had no water. That was luxury. We had no water for 9 years. It just becomes this huge thing, So you understand what I'm saying, Kiko? It's like, how do I get prepared for suffering? Why am I so unprepared for that as a missionary?
My mom. So I think the same way as Pastor Tom has said that I don't know anything about suffering. What do we call? And agree with you too that it's a definition is so fluid. What is suffering to someone else is not suffering to me, and vice versa. And I've been in the Far East, and luckily I've been in the places that are like big cities.
Okay.
And when, by the way, that verse in 2 Timothy 3, in the original language, which is Finnish language, in the Bible, it says that
is there any other language?
who live godly will suffer persecution.
Okay.
So the translator into Finnish language calls it persecution instead of suffering. But I think we can all identify with that something is against us.
Yes.
Something or somebody is against our faith, wants to put down our trust in him. And I've been in the places that are so-called civilized places, big places, and there hasn't been that kind of uh, suffering or hardship that I can against me, but I have maybe seen some things around me, like some persons in the body who have been who have lost their jobs because of their faith.
Sure.
They haven't been trusted in their workplace anymore because of their faith. Or in some places, as they say, they've given shoes that are too small to wear, meaning that they still can work in their job, but the environment or the boss makes it so impossible for them to walk in those shoes
Yeah.
because they're too small, so that they leave on their own.
Wow.
But as far as physical suffering, if I can tell stories, is that okay?
It's always good to tell Kiko stories.
Yeah, well, this is just from a person that I met at the church who was from another location, from a smaller place, from a countryside town. And he was pastoring, I think, about 9 different home churches. And each of those home churches had a leader. And he said that sometimes the local officials come and ransack their meetings and take the leader to the police station and put them into jail. But the reason is not because they know something about Christianity, that would be that kind of persecution. But the reason is that they think that the church loves their pastor so much that they would pay money to the police so that
Wow.
pastor gets out. So, but finally, the police figured out that the church people are so poor, they have no money to bail their pastor, so they stopped doing that. So they went through suffering, but maybe that's like one, how would I say? It's amazing that when we end up in a situation and we are in that place because God put us there,
Okay.
there's always a provision, always.
Yes.
And like, I guess you could think that there are limitations in some countries and some areas, limitations of how you can function as a church or how you can function as a Christian, how openly you can be and show your faith. There might be limitations, but the life of God is so creative. It's like water that finds the cracks and flows through, and the life of God is like dynamite. It like breaks through those limitations and finds a creative way to show his love to people. So yes, there might be limitations and suffering in that sense, but God.
Let me ask you a straight question, Kiko. Are we prepared to suffer? I mean, it's interesting. There's no Bible college class. When you go to Bible school, you get trained for missions, and I'm a missions major, and I'm thinking missions. Are we prepared to suffer?
Prepared to suffer.
I mean, if you think about it, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's like that constant fellowship with him. And like Pastor Tom said, it's like I know him in a sense that each situation that comes ahead or where I find myself, it's like, God, here I am. This is happening. What now? So I don't know if you can like train yourself in any other way except just getting to know him and walking with him, and he's with you.
That's Chris. Let me ask you the same question, because I find that I know there is no really straight answer for this, but are we really prepared to suffer when we go plant the church, when we go to on the mission field, when we're going on the mission? Are we prepared to suffer?
First of all, thanks for inviting me on this call with you guys. Pastor Tom, that was a great word. For me, your story and your life just resembles what you're talking about, some of the dark nights you've walked through, we're all aware of. So we're just thankful for your life. And Kiko, yeah, you've just been in some amazing places. So it's just a blessing to be on this call with you guys, Pastor Ronaldo. I think that if we are walking with God day to day, we are being prepared by God in His sovereign plan to be to face impact when it comes. And I think there's this we're being prepared in unawares of how to prepare for impact. And I think Bible school is that way. Pastor Stevens talked a lot about suffering. And then I think too, we watch people in the body of Christ that quietly walk through some very, very difficult times, and we see their simplicity. We see that, and it's funny because when you look at someone that's gone through a lot, it's not a lot to look at. It's not a lot of pizzazz or wow, there he is, the guy who's suffering, but it's kind of just a very maybe in the world's eyes mundane. So are we prepared to suffer? I would like to think that we are, if we're walking with God moment by moment, like Kiko was saying, that constant communion.
Let me ask you this question, Pastor Chris, because I'm thinking wide with you here. The world has this idea of missions that, if you're a missionary, you have to look like you're suffering. You have to look the part. So they want the newsletter that talks about suffering. But it's got to be something extraordinary. It's got to be something romanticized, the novels. We all want to go to the raps and hear the stories of how you've walked through suffering and how God has been faithful. But it's always like it becomes like a merit badge. It becomes a greeting card for missions. Yes, you're a missionary because you've suffered, because then it flip-flops the other way, and Christians say, because I'm suffering, that's missions. So it doesn't work both ways. Or it becomes this affirmation that I'm really doing missions because, like Pastor Tom said, I want to reign with him, so I want to make sure I'm doing the kind of suffering that he's talking about. And maybe in my own introspection, I don't think I'm doing that kind of suffering. So I disqualify myself from my call because I haven't suffered enough. Or the other side of that, and sometimes you get this with supporters, they want to hear about how you've suffered. Tell me the story of how you suffered, of what you walked through, what you've been through. So it becomes a lot of times messages and testimonies that are laden with stories of suffering because that's the jazz. That's the thing that people want to hear. So then when you look at your life, and like Pastor Tom said, when you don't have all of that, flamboyance, like we walked through a river and there was no boat and we floated above and God raised us and, rocks split in half. You don't have those Red Sea stories. You just have like manna stories. You have like quiet stories of a daily walk with God. So I wonder sometimes if we don't look at our life and devalue our walk with God on the mission field because we're not Hudson Taylor, because we're not Amy Carmichael, because we're not David Livingston, we're not David Brainerd. And that's mentioning David Brainerd, quiet ministry, quiet life, suffered a lot, very little fruit, very little attention. It wasn't until after he was gone that all of a sudden things exploded. But there's a lot of David Brainerds out there that are pretty much quietly walking with God. And or this is what happens too. Sometimes, Pastor Chris, I know I'm giving you a lot here. Sometimes you have guys that are going through things on the mission field, but because of this bravado that I'm walking with God, I'm built for this, I'm ready for this, they don't say anything. They suffer. They think that suffering quietly is courage, but you don't say a word to anybody. Maybe you're not handling it well. There's things that are happening in your walk, in your turmoil, naturally, physically, but you're quiet to yourself because you feel that I'm not allowed to say anything because missions are supposed to just take it. You're prepared for this. And I like the reality that if I walk with God, that I'm prepared for whatever God brings. But the reality is many times when God brings things, I'm walking with God and I'm caught off guard. I would love to be David in Psalm 23, but maybe I'm more like the writer of Psalm 73. I'm living in 73 more than I'm living in Psalm 23. So my question would be, Pastor Chris, just this thinking with you here, is it okay to suffer and talk about it? Is it okay to suffer and actually would not measure it or compare myself?
Well, that's some great content, Pastor Ronaldo. I think when we have that amazing privilege to meet somebody who has really suffered with God, we discover that there's treasure there that's inside of them that can't be really advertised or marketed. And maybe it's even treasure that could not even be understood or rightly appreciated by someone who hasn't suffered. And I think that one of the and I think to your question, Pastor Ronaldo, I think some of the greatest people on the planet or in the kingdom of God that have suffered are probably people that we have not even met. I mean, I think about African pastors that have just walked through some incredible stuff, that never talk about it. And I think that, and it's because generally we as creatures are really, really limited to the dimensions that we live in: the sight, sound, the five senses, and that's really where we live until we discover that there's something much deeper than our surface experiences in our life, and that is that we've been built really for something bigger. We actually have a bigger capacity for pain than we do for joy or entertainment. And I say that because when we are living in our surface life, eventually, whether we're a Christian or not a Christian, life happens, and we are plowed deep into our souls, plowed deep into the bigger questions, which is that I've been made for deep fellowship with God. And and I think that the great expression of God, the revelation of God in the Bible, in the world, is a revelation not of joy or entertainment or blessing, but really of a cross. And so we've been really made, that God has called us and made us to walk through what we would call suffering. And I think that because of this suffering and because of the world that we live in that's fallen, it's a fallen creation, and all of creation, Romans chapter 8, really pleads for the manifestation of the kingdom of God, the sons of God. And I think that what we live in and what we see on a continual basis with suffering worldwide, I mean, we see it worldwide and then with our neighbor, is that it's so illogical, and that we don't really live in a logical world, because the logical world doesn't make any sense. Suffering doesn't make any sense. And I think if we were to look at Job's life, Job is a story of a few things. Number one, he's a story it's a book that's not a book about doctrine. It's a book about a man's experience asking the most important and the most commonly asked question in human history, and that's why. Why? And we see so much in that book. And I was thinking earlier today, Job 23, verse 4, 3, 4, 5. Job doesn't have something that we have today, and that is a mercy seat that he can run to, someone that's pleading his case. And he's looking for someone to walk through that pain with him and that could answer him. And we as a believer have that. We have Jesus Christ. And remember Revelations, when we see the scene in the throne room of God, the incredible angels and the seraphim and just the glorious things that we can't even imagine that are existing there. And then right in the middle of it, it says, in the midst of the throne is a lamb. It's a lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. And it's a creature. It's something that is vulnerable. And so I would say that when we really cry out for understanding for why is this all happening, when we see someone else's pain, which, and I guess the last thing I'll say about this is that when someone's really suffering, I think the wisdom of the first few chapters of Job is good, where his friends are not really saying much, because if someone is really suffering, if there's a lot of pain there, I think that sometimes we feel compelled to say something, or maybe even something religious.
Yeah.
And that can only insult people. And I think the best way we can comfort someone is really being present. And that's what we see with Christ in John chapter 11. Jesus walks in, he weeps because his dear friends are weeping, his people are weeping.
Mhm.
and then he walks right in. And I think being present in suffering um, is really the best thing that we can do. But this is a beautiful topic, Pastor. Very good topic.
It's one of those topics that we don't really discuss corporately or publicly. There really aren't conferences about suffering as a theme. It's not one of those things that there's classes on it. I did find a Bible school that does offer a class on suffering, which is quite interesting. They devoted an entire curriculum towards suffering. It's a lot fair. I understand why they would do that. But I was thinking of this verse, Kiko, when it kind of encapsulates what you were saying in Philippians 3:10. That Paul says that I may know him. He's saying this after 18 years as a man of God. He says that I may know him. And then he divides the knowing into the power of his resurrection and then the fellowship of his suffering being made conformable unto his death. Now, we talk a lot about the cross in our ministry. One of the few ministries that emphasizes having a daily cross, an experiential cross, and having a relationship with God through the work that was done on the cross, the finished work. Tie that in with our suffering, because really, if we're dying daily and walking in the cross, that is the floor of our suffering, and everything proceeds from that, I would think.
Yeah, Pastor Ronaldo, I think you just pinpointed it. That's what it is.
What's interesting, Kiko, is like, but without the cross, am I really prepared to suffer? Yeah.
No. It's that mystery of the cross where I see his face.
Mm-hmm.
His presence, his closeness.
That kind of lends itself to Pastor Tom's comment about it's just me and him. So then I don't see suffering; I just see him, right? But really, when we think about suffering, and a lot of times I'm not belittling someone's situation or what they're going through. I'm not minimizing it at all. I know sometimes we have a tendency just to throw out phrases at people. Well, just go to the cross with that. And we're insensitive maybe to where they're at with God or their capacity or what they're going through. I don't want to be insensitive. But I do want to find the floor, the bottom. Because if I don't find the floor, every time I go through anything, small or big, I'm unprepared. I'm shocked. I'm ambushed by the plan of God, right? I'm not ready to fellowship with his suffering. I'm just hunting the power of his resurrection. And I'm celebrating Sunday and ignoring Friday. There's a lot of Sunday Christians like Hallelujah, Resurrection Sunday. I don't want to. We don't talk about Friday. We don't get involved in Friday. That's a bad day, right? But we're going to celebrate the Sunday. But everybody wants the Sunday. No one wants to get through the Friday. And really, the crux of my experience when I suffer really is the Friday that gets me to the Sunday. Wouldn't you say, Pastor Tom?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand what you just said, what that means, but I was.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, I mean, I think we can be prepared in a general sense. I think like we can read the Bible and say, okay, it looks like there's suffering involved here in our lives. But I had this thought one time that. The trial of our faith, it's Peter called it a fiery trial, right?
Yep.
And the trial of our faith is more precious than gold, tried in the fire. And Paul called it light affliction, but for a moment, etc. We got a lot of verses related to the trial. But is it a trial if I don't actually have any suffering in it? Or like, in other words, if I'm hyper prepared for everything, then I get on top of suffering maybe, and suffering I eliminate why God is allowing suffering in my life, and and what is the purpose in suffering? Because I think suffering with God, and I think it's an important point. We say this with people who are grieving. Maybe we don't say it right in the middle of their grief, but eventually, when we want to say this, every suffering has a purpose. There's a purpose. If you're a Christian, every trial has a beginning and an end.
Mhm.
Every suffering has a purpose, um, and a lot of the purpose is in him conforming us to the image of Christ,
Yes.
which is an issue that is actually, I think, sometimes not thought about. If we become this very evangelistically motivated.
Mhm.
um, I'm building a church now. We're building a church, but God at the same time is conforming you to the image of Christ. So I guess my answer to the whole thing is we can't be totally prepared for suffering because it wouldn't be suffering then.
Mm.
That's kind of just a rationale maybe I came up with myself, but I think it's part of my experience.
Okay.
It's like I think the shock element in suffering is is vital to the purpose God has in the whole deal.
Hmm.
I mean all the suffering that I see in the Bible, which we can just label time after time. I mean all these various ones people suffered. Job, you brought that, Jacob, um, point after point,
Sure.
various sufferings. These guys were just, it was just came upon them
Mhm.
at a time unawares,
Sure.
and although we can have a general understanding that okay, suffering is part of the deal, nevertheless, I think God needs to surprise us,
Hmm.
and I think He also surprises us with how He's going to handle it, how He does it,
Mhm.
and so that's just my point of view.
I love that. I like that's very fresh. Instead of asking the question, are we prepared? Do we need to be prepared? And maybe that's the whole point of the trial, as Pastor Thomas just brought out, that part of the necessity of surprise is there, or the unexpected preparation. You're not prepared for that, so you just kind of walk into that, and you walk into that, as Kiko said, you walk into that with God. You walk in it with God. So if I'm a missionary and I'm on the field and things are happening, it's great to plan, it's great to prepare, but you can't prepare for everything, right? You can't prepare for everything, but you can walk with God in what He has prepared. I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 5. Elizabeth Elliott said that she read that verse the day that her husband went out with
Yeah.
Nate Saints, and he was
Mhm.
murdered by the Ark Indians. She said this verse was the verse that God gave her in a morning devotional, and then the word came back. Her husband didn't come back, and she said that was the verse, and it says, "He who has prepared us for this very thing is God." That God knows what we need. He's preparing us, and if you really think that all the way through, Pastor Tom, everything that's happening in my life preparing me for the next thing, and suffering is part of the preparation for the next thing. So it's almost like I'm prepared for the moment, capacity wise, right? You could say 1 Corinthians 10:13, right? That there's no trial or test of temptation taking you, but such as is common to man. So in that measure, there is a measure of preparation capacity wise. But on the other side of it, like you said, the shock and awe of being caught off guard. I mean, it's amazing how our faith can be so tried by what, like an ambush. I mean, you read book after book of guys that I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't know what to do. I and the provision is God. The provision is God, right? I'm reduced to just a walk with God, right? I'm reduced to at the cross. I'm reduced to that. So really, on the one side, we were talking about earlier, the cross is my ultimate preparation for whatever suffering I'm going to face. On the other side, there's Pastor Tom is saying that maybe uh, the unpreparedness is part of the plan. It's part of the purpose of God that I'm unprepared. I don't know if, and sometimes we make choices that lead us to suffer, and God allows that. Sometimes, a lot of times, I often say, well, that's not the devil. That's just me making a bad decision. That's not suffering. That's just me not being wise in a specific situation. Or that's not suffering. That's just the reality of life, as you said. It's just life. Like, remember, nowadays people say when you have all kind of things happen in your life, they say to you, well, you know what, it's this or it's that, and you say, well, can I just have a bad day? Can I just be sad for a few minutes? Does that have to be a condition? Do I need a diagnosis for that, right? And I think sometimes we hunt labels so that we can justify feeling the way we feel. Like, I'm suffering right now, and we just buy into that. But I love the idea that Pastor Tom has, and maybe Pastor Christian, you can share on that as well, about the enjoyment or the purpose and not being prepared for what God is bringing, the unpreparedness.
Yeah, Job certainly wasn't prepared. He wasn't, and I think that when we are blindsided, when we are hit, when we're called on to suffer, you look at Job. Job did not understand the context of what was happening. He didn't have the privilege of knowing the warfare before his suffering began. And the main question really was two things. Number one, God's veracity, his character, who God was. And number two, who Job was, because you see him really defending himself and his personal righteousness and how good he thought he was. So I think this suffering reveals a lot about ourselves, and it also reveals a lot about God. And in the end, we don't see God giving, "Hey, okay, Job, here's the reason why that's why this has all happened." And so Job, in the end, is not even explained. It's not even explained to him the only thing that Job gets to see is God. And that's what Pastor Tom is saying. That's what you're saying, Pastor Ronaldo and Kiko, is that really, in the end, it's just Christ in us, and that's really what the goal of all suffering is that we would discover who God is. We would discover more about how we would discover the riches of his grace and his kindness and stuff, because we're just we are so not righteous in the way we think we are. And we need more. We need grace and his mercy so much more than we think we do. And so Paul here has this beautiful perspective, understanding of what pain is. We know C.S. Lewis said that pain insists on being attended to, because God is shouting, and God's megaphone to us, to a deaf world, is pain. We live in a pain-free society. We live in a society where you can manage your pain, and pain really is something that's a gift from God. It just says that something's wrong, and it needs to be corrected. And I think that whenever we're plowed under by the actuals of life, and plowed into by sorrow and just unspeakable grief, and I was thinking this morning, like, I was just thinking about some of the people that I know that have just walked through, they've lost a spouse, and maybe they've never had a child. They've never had that joy of, maybe someone who's given their entire life to God, never had the opportunity or had the joys of being married, but yet they are walking with God. I think what makes us a missionary and what makes us prepared is a call, as a call of God. And that call is it's such an honor. I think it's such a joy. And so Paul says here, even though the outward man is perishing, my outward man is perishing, I'm being renewed. And I think that just in suffering, during that process, we need to be renewed in baby steps, taking little baby steps, and having that perspective, a biblical perspective. When we look at war, when we look at what's happening in the world, I think when disaster or catastrophe happens, we are jolted out of our surface life, and we are plowed deep into a place where we have to ask some very big questions about God and about the world that we live in. And that's when the Bible becomes very, very real to us. Until then, we're just living in an unreasonable life. The basis of life seems to be tragic, and we can live there, we can stay there without being comforted until we really look at the word that is describing the whole thing. What Pastor Tom said about purpose. like we have a friend that just recently passed away, tragically died 2 weeks ago. And I think a lot of times when people are suffering, you have that rush of condolences, and then maybe 3 or 4 months later, it's just crickets, right?
Yeah.
And that's when I think really people need a phone call. That's when I think they need a visit, some presence. And that's the beautiful thing. And Pastor Ronaldo, I was reading that story. I was reading the story of Elizabeth Elliott when she lost her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to read it. It's like a short, just short here.
Go for it.
She said this: "When I stood by my shortwave radio in the jungle of Ecuador in 1956 and heard that my husband Jim was missing, God brought to my mind the words of the prophet Isaiah: 'When thou pass through the waters, I will be with thee.'" And so and she just talks about how she wrestled. Like she says, I appreciate the presence, but I want Jim's presence. And I think that when she found out 5 days later that he had died, she discovered God's presence. And I think that in suffering, we're really discovering Christ and His presence, and that's why we maybe don't have a lot to say. I mean, you ask someone who has really been through suffering, there's not a lot of words, because it really is a person, and when you have two vessels that have been broken by the cross, when you've been broken by God's plan and have been made malleable by the hands of Christ, like when He broke the bread at the communion, the Last Supper, He said, "This is my body, I'm breaking it," and then He blessed it. By the way, we can't be blessed until we're broken. Mm-hmm. True blessing doesn't happen until the bread's broken. He said, when that happens, then you can sit down with like people that are on this call, like people that we have around us. We could sit and maybe not even say a lot, but there would be this communion of the testimony of Kiko or Pastor Ronaldo or Pastor Sleeva's life, men and women are in our church. You could sit there and there's this quiet communion of understanding,
Yeah.
Excellent. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Kiko?
Yeah, that's yeah. And that broken bread, isn't it? When it's broken, it's shared for others.
Wow, that's good.
How that suffering, maybe it's for others' sake.
Yes.
Like we read stories of those Christians who have been really physically beaten, like in that way persecuted, and like that American lady who was in Tibet, and God told her that the reason why they are beating you is because that's the only way I can show them my love. So yeah. Wow. And as you said, Pastor Chris, that there's a treasure inside of those people who have walked through heavy things, like I see in you, Pastor Tom, especially, and there's something really authentic. There's nothing to boast. It's not something that you boast about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Like Pastor Ronaldo, you said in the beginning, like Paul didn't boast about all those things that he's listing there, but when he said that, I do boast, but I boast about my weakness.
Yeah.
And
That's
good. So it's something authentic. It's Jesus in us. It's for others.
It's beautiful.
I want to manage to glean a little bit today, a lot actually, about preparation for suffering. My talk so far, number one is that it's a measure of normality to our walk with God. It's not a shock. It's not a surprise in that way. So when I suffer as a missionary, it's part of my walk with God. It's part of the fellowship of my walk with God. So there's a normalizing of it that exists. It's not a justifying of it, but it's a normalizing of it. It's a difference. Justification speaks more of my approving of it, and I often, if ever, will ever approve of it, but I normalize it in the sense of that, okay, this is part of my opportunity to fellowship with God, and I don't want to separate this from the successes and and the victories in my life, this is also another area that I can fellowship with God. So I normalize it in the way of fellowship. Second thing I've kind of gathered is that um, I don't want the suffering to self-define me. That works both ways, where I justify who I am because I've suffered, or I disqualify myself because I haven't suffered as others have suffered. So I don't want to self-define based on what I'm going through. And then number three, that the cross is my ultimate preparation for whatever God is bringing towards me and whatever suffering it is. And then I don't have to categorize the suffering, whether my car battery doesn't work, whether I've lost my sister. All of those things require the cross. I don't have to use the cross for the heavy duty things, and I don't have to use the cross for the light things. That's really my ultimate preparation. Those are just three things that I've gleaned from our conversation so far. And going back to the first one, if I normalize it, when it comes and I'm unprepared for it, I'm okay with not being prepared for it. Sometimes you feel like you're not walking with God because you're not prepared for it. Well, maybe I'm not prepared for it, and it's okay. It's fine. It's okay. I didn't expect that. Yeah, I didn't. But here we are. So you do that faith pivot. Well, okay, it's happening. It's real. Okay, God, what are we going to do? Or what are you going to do? How am I going to follow you, right? There's that pivot. Those are three things that I got from our conversation so far. Maybe last words, Pastor Tom?
Yeah. Well, two things. By the way, I mean, you guys have just said so many things that are so right on in my heart. Anyhow, I appreciate it so much. But two things I was thinking about that we haven't said yet, maybe, are, well, one of them is what you just said. You know, I think we all have come to realize this, in ministering with people, is that, there's a person that has a very small capacity, and suffering for them, we wouldn't even maybe notice it,
Mm-hmm.
but they're going through a lot, and I'm learning how to get on their level, when I'm talking to them, so that
Sure.
I can love them and realize they're really going through something. The other thing I think, that is a purpose in suffering, and this is, well, we all have blind spots. Dr. Stevens used to talk about the blind spot, but and I'll just use myself as a testimony. When I lost my son, I found out so many blind spots about myself. Things that we unconsciously won't allow to come into our lives. I mean, I could hear a message on a certain subject, but it does not touch me because I'm well defensed. My soul has that thing hidden away somewhere because maybe I'm just absolutely ashamed of it, and I can't even bear to think about it or talk about it. But God knows it's there, and it's hurting. It's hurting. It's hurting what you said, Pastor Chris. It's hurting the presence of God in my life. Like, in other words, like God is in conforming me to the image of His Son. He wants to show me another big part of who He is, who God is, and God doesn't show us the blind spots to hurt us, but that I would realize His grace is even bigger than that stuff. His grace is bigger than my terribleness. I might even just come face to face with some terrible thing deep in my soul.
Mm-hmm.
And all this, but then God says, hey, listen, I've been trying to show you this for years because I just want you to know my grace is bigger than that. Like, I love you. And now I can live knowing full well, you know, how potentially evil I am. At the same time, God is saying, I see you perfect. I love you. It's like, you're awesome. I'm using you. It's quite a balance of things, but it really it really makes the grace of God bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And suffering, I think Job, Job repented at the end of his trial,
Yes.
and I always say this: what for? Like, God was fine. God didn't even rebuke Job at the end. He rebuked the friends.
Mhm.
He didn't say a word to Job.
True.
But Job just realized some stuff about himself. I think that's my point. Yeah,
Mhm.
he just realized a few things in the middle of the whole deal that he didn't really treat God so fairly, and he wasn't very respectful of God and a couple things like that maybe. But I think God was doing a whole big work in Job, and evidenced by his statement at the end, I knew thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Like, I think Job had a total identity crisis, and he found a new God,
Beautiful.
a new and awesome, more awesome God than ever before. So that's
Wow. That's amazing. I love that quote from Job. That's good. That's a great capstone to the program. Pastor Chris, any last words?
Amen. Beautiful. Just a great time of fellowship with you guys.
Beautiful.
Really.
Kiko, any last words at all?
Yeah, when we go through things, it's like I am with you.
Mm-hmm.
He said,
Yes.
I am the
Yes.
great I am.
Mm. And if you've noticed in the program, this underlying current of just me and God, have you got that? That all of us have been saying that underlying it's just fellowship with God, fellowship with God. That's the best preparation, fellowship with God. That's also the best foundation, fellowship with God. Wouldn't you say, Kiko?
I would say amen.
Okay, because if Kiko doesn't say it, it's not true, Pastor Tom. I just want to tell you
Come
right
on.
now, she's not stamping that. No.
Come on.
But this is a
It's an honor
huge,
to be with you all.
Kiko, this is a
Likewise.
huge topic, suffering. It's the thing that missionaries go through, talk about with God, but you don't really talk to a lot of people about your suffering. It might show up later, years later, in a story somewhere. You end up being like Paul, where I knew a man who suffered, but I won't say his name. That becomes our testimony. But we'll be getting into this. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Next week, we'll get into this some more on the missionary and suffering, because now that I'm prepared to suffer, how do I suffer well? How do I suffer well? All of us suffer. We've established that. In this world you shall have tribulation, right? John 16:33. All who walk godly will suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3:13. Okay, so how do I suffer well? Next week, this place, this time, we'll look at suffering well, suffering in missions. Until then, God bless you. Have a great weekend. Have a great week. Thinking missions. Keep thinking missions. Bye for now.
Love you guys.
Take care now.